Now, to kick off this afternoon, I want to hand over to Veronica Chow, who's a partner and director of sustainable investing and social impact at BCG. She's going to be leading a BCG curated session, which will take a closer look at what it might take to reach our climate finance goals, which is one of the really the most critical subjects we have here in front of us. So I please give Veronica a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to our hosts at New York Times for bringing together such a rich and vibrant discussion, pulling together civil society, private sector, public sector on such an important moment. We're having a discussion now about climate finance and what it will take to achieve our climate finance goals. As many of you know, this is the implementation COP. This was the COP for us to come together a year after some very bold commitments were made in Glasgow. Commitments to align the global financial system to reach a net zero economy by 2050. Commitments to finance the transition in such a way that it will be just and orderly, and that for that finance to reach the communities and countries that need that finance the most. And so this is a conversation we'll have now to really reckon with that. Here we are 1 year later. What have we seen? Are we on track? Are we not? And if not, what do we need to do? And I couldn't think of two better people to help me explore this question than the two gentlemen I have on stage with me. To my right, we have Daniel Hanna, who is the global head of sustainable finance at Barclays Bank and brings a distinguished track record throughout his entire career of pioneering sustainable finance across the globe. So welcome, Daniel. And to my left, I have Bruce Usher, who is a professor at Columbia Business School. He is also the faculty director of the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise, and he is also the author of a recent book, Investing in the Era of Climate Change. So I literally have on one hand the pioneer leading work day to day, and on the other hand, someone who's literally written the book about this topic. So welcome. So let's dive into it. You know, last COP, big commitments were made to finance the transition. We at BCG, we've done some analysis where we compared the amount of financing that has flowed relative to the needs. The data that we had was for 2020, but what we found was for every dollar that was actually spent on decarbonization in 2020, we would have needed 4 more to stay on track. What's even more alarming is in 2020, for every $1 that was spent on adaptation and resilience, we would have needed 9 more to be ready for the ever-increasing physical impacts of extreme heat, water, weather. So it's a pretty stark picture. Now, the three of us, we've been here in Sharm el-Sheikh now for a couple of days. Yesterday was Finance Day. Yesterday was the day that we were meant to hear, are we on track? So let me just open up to both of you from what you've heard the past couple of days. What are your take? Daniel, do you want to start?
So first of all, let me say a very big thank you to the New York Times and to Veronica for inviting me to this great panel, very timely given, as you say, we've just had Finance Day. I'd start by saying what we didn't hear yesterday. So I don't think we heard any game-changing new announcements. But equally, if you look at it from a glass half full point of view, I don't think we heard any let up in the focus and momentum. I think many of us coming into this COP, given the geopolitical situation, given high energy prices, given the concerns that people have about recession, cost of living, I think we're quite worried that there would be maybe a lot of focus around the need for pragmatism or slowing down or changing. But I don't think we've heard that. I think very much, as you said, it has been much more about implementation. And I think we've seen 2 types of things so far. One is a sort of continuation of the initiatives that were kicked off at the last COP. So if you think about the sort of country transition packages that we've seen, the South Africa JTIP, and then the continuing conversations with other countries, that sounds quite positive at the moment. And then I think we've seen other things like Kerry's announcement around using carbon credits to accelerate the transition and move away from coal and other sources of power, which haven't got the detail but sound quite interesting. So we're not even halfway yet through COP, so I guess we'll all be watching over the next coming days to see what more will come out of the negotiations and the discussions.
Yeah, Bruce, any thoughts from your side?
Well, I completely agree that there's no shocking new initiatives that have come out in the last couple of days. But this is the implementation COP, and I think a lot of the discussion that we've had to date, and even opening our panel, has been focused on what we are not doing. And that's important. We need to know what the end goal is to keep us on the path. I would like to see more focus on what we are doing, and more specifically, where we are doing it, where it is working, and where it's not. Or to put it in a different context, I don't teach my students in business school, graduate school, about what we are not doing. I teach them about what we are doing and understand how do we do more. In other words, how do we scale? And ultimately, that's really the challenge here, is to scale the activity that's already there.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Let me pick up on this one because, so what are we doing and how do we scale it faster? Let's start with technology. So we know that in order to achieve our 1.5 degree scenario, we need to develop a lot of new technologies, but we have a lot actually that works. We just need to get them to scale. You know, Daniel, you're at a leading global bank. Your bank is financing a lot of the scale. Can you tell us what are banks doing to get money into the technologies that we actually need?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Bruce and you've just said there about the importance of scaling what we've got and thinking about it. And if you like, we've got the playbook for the climate transition at one level, at a very high level. The first thing is we need to electrify what we can and power that through renewables with the build-in of storage. The second thing is we need to tackle the hard-to-abate sectors. So these are the areas of the economy where we don't yet know what the solution is, whether it's steel or others. And there we need innovation, and we need to move that to commercialization. And then the third step is we need to build resilience in the system that we're building, and also really start thinking about adaptation finance. The more you do of 1 and 2, the less you're going to need of 3, and the more that you do of 1 and 2 and 3, the less you're going to have the issue around loss and damages. So on the first point, I think we are making progress. So in terms of electrification and renewables, we are seeing, I think, a bit of a step change. So the World Energy Outlook, the IEA put out just a few days ago, showed that since Paris, we've seen a 5-fold increase in wind and solar. So that's a significant step up. But to achieve net zero, we know that we need to actually probably include, well, the IEA estimate we need to treble that investment on an annual basis going forward. So I think all banks are sort of looking at how they can really scale that. Barclays has mobilized more than $82 billion since 2018 on this. If you just take the UK, we've been involved in 6 offshore wind farm financings since 2019. But I think we recognize, and the industry recognizes, we need to do more of this, and we need to do it faster. On the second side, this is much trickier in the hard-to-abate sectors. In some of these sectors, we sort of do know what the technology solution is. So, for example, I mentioned steel. I think we can see a solution where you shift to green hydrogen. The question then is, can we get the technology to a price point where it becomes commercial as quickly as possible? In other areas, let's take agriculture right at the other end of the extreme. I don't think anyone's really cracked what the right model to drive radical decarbonization in the agricultural system. So what do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to take a sector-by-sector approach. So, for example, Barclays just signed up with Oxford University on a 3-year groundbreaking agreement to really look at the decarbonization of agriculture in the UK. But then secondly, we really need to seed innovation. And that's about finding good ideas and giving them the capital to really prove the technology. So to give you an example, Barclays has invested in a hydrogen company on its own balance sheet. We've put equity into a hydrogen services company called Protium, or an agriculture company that uses 95% less water. And we've got a dedicated team looking out for these opportunities. And then we really need to find out, once you have the technology, to use what Bill Gates called, how do we get the green premium down as quickly as possible? And I think here, traditional finance has not been well set up. The sort of venture capital firms, or the traditional PE, have not been set up to really take that technology and scale it. We have seen new funds like Beyond Net Zero, the sort of decarbonization partners being set up to tackle that. And I think as a bank, we're also actively looking at how we can really tackle this. And I think it's going to require some innovation in different types of products. And it's also going to require an ecosystem approach where we look across the entire value chain and think about how that entire value chain can contribute to the decarbonization of that specific sector.
If I could just follow up on that, I love your framework. There might be one other component, though, the idea of phasing out, managed phase out of coal plants, of fossil fuel. Do you have a perspective on how do we think about financing phasing out of some of these more higher emitting assets?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it is a difficult subject because at one end, you really want to make sure that financing is going to the new technology, the leapfrog technology, if you like, that can really show that alternative. But at the same time, as I think we've seen with the current squeeze in energy prices, you do need to get that transition as quickly, as finely balanced as possible. And so I think one of the things that was quite interesting about Kerry's proposal, for example, is around whether you can use things like carbon markets and others that really can then sort of drive the incentive and the financing such that you are reducing the sort of reliance on, for example, coal as quickly as possible. And I think we all need to get away from coal as quickly as we can. Now, there's a lot of complexity in there in terms of making sure that you've got, verification and that you've got a real solid baseline to show that this is actually driving the decarbonization. But I do think it is something that we haven't quite found the model, but there's a lot of interesting ideas exploring at the moment.
Yeah. Bruce, in your book, you looked at exactly as Daniel was saying, this green premium and how for certain technologies in certain parts of the United States, we actually have managed to make some progress to the point now where some of these technologies are cost competitive. Any insights from there that could actually have applicability now for other parts of the world as we think about how to get financing to where it's most needed?
Sure. So as Daniel pointed out, electrify everything is really renewables. Renewables today are cost competitive. In fact, in most of the world today, they are the cheapest source of power. And there is no shortage of capital available to that sector other than in the less developed economies. And caveat, because I want to come back to that, it's a really important challenge. But for U.S., frankly, North America, Europe, Japan, China, India, these sectors are growing at extraordinary pace. And we have grown since I became involved in climate finance 20 years ago. These sectors have grown 100x, 100 times, and are on pace to replace fossil fuels. There is a concern around the building of coal plants. But keep in mind, as long as we keep building renewables at the pace we're building, the coal plants will not be operated because the marginal operating cost of coal is always higher than renewables. Renewable energy has essentially a zero marginal operating cost. So let's just put that aside for a second. What do we know about what made those sectors, renewable energy, and the other sector Chan touched on, by the way, is electric vehicles, which is a little bit behind, but the growth rates are now at the point, we're at an inflection point on EVs as well. So these are the sectors where access to capital is very clear through commercial sources like Barclays and many others. What are the lessons that we can now apply to the sectors that are not yet at scale? And the lesson is these things don't happen on their own, and they don't happen purely with the private sector. They happen for two reasons. One is a combination of capital from philanthropists, or what are sometimes called philanthrocapitalists, who are focused on this issue, organizations like Breakthrough Energy Ventures. They happen from companies that are concerned about their business model and looking to the future and are far-sighted plans, so corporate investment. And then also working with commercial investors alongside policy. Policy doesn't happen in a vacuum effectively. Policy is effective when it sees how it can unlock the capital. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which we've just seen passed, this is an incredibly powerful piece of policy because it's not that the act itself is about $500 billion. That's a big number. The real number is how much private capital it's unlocking, and that is in the many trillions. So if we want to unlock other sectors, green hydrogen, maybe direct air capture, agriculture, all these other sectors, we can't just say, oh, the private sector has to provide more financing. They do. But you unlock that financing with a combination of philanthropic capital or catalytic capital, with corporate investment, with policies, targeted niche policies. And that's what gets this sort of flywheel of investment and innovation going, drives down costs, and gets us to where we are in renewables today. I also want to talk about emerging economies and the challenge there, but perhaps should we circle back to that?
Yeah,
or?
no. Why don't we go there right now? Because
Okay.
your comment it resonates, and yet my mind goes to those countries who might not have the equivalent of a Gates Foundation, that might not have a large corporate sector that's willing to just plow significant parts of their balance sheet into long-term big bets on new types of technology. So what are we going to do in those markets?
Yeah, and there are markets, and I want to be clear here, we tend to divide developed, developing. I think that's an overgeneralization. That's not helpful.
Yep.
We need to look at very specific countries, and even within countries, sub-regions, because the opportunity and the challenges vary a bit. But there are obviously developing economies that are not receiving enough capital. In fact, as we were discussing before, Daniel, the amount of investment is pretty flat in the last decade. It's not growing at all. And here the challenge is, how do you move capital into sectors that require long-term investment, like renewables and EVs? What are the challenges of doing so? And the challenges are often political challenges, foreign exchange challenges, frankly, challenges of risk. And how do you overcome that challenge? And the answer is, investors see risk in these markets because they don't have experience in these markets. In other words, the risk is perceived risk. It's not actually necessarily experiential risk. There's very little experience investing in, say, large-scale solar in many developing countries. So how do you change that perceived risk to understanding the actual risk? And the way you do that is with concessional capital. Concessional capital with multilateral development banks or philanthropic capital or even sometimes corporate capital. Actually, I don't like this word concessional.
Yes.
Concessional sounds like we're giving something away, making a concession. No. The role here of this kind of capital is to draw in traditional investors so that they participate to the part, they start to understand that the perceived risk of these investments is actually higher than the actual risk, that your actual experience, you can find the models and the opportunities to actually put capital to work.
Yep.
That's what happened in renewables in Europe and the US. The perceived risk was very high, and we've now shown it's low. We need to do the same in these other countries with this concessional capital.
Exactly. And, Daniel, you've been at the center of many of these transactions in terms of blended finance. So is it as easy as Bruce was saying? And, I was in another panel this week where someone from another financial institution said, look, I got a deal done with blended finance. It took me a year. It was like $10 million, something like this. In the market where they operate, a very developed market, they did 10x, right? So, and what's the lived experience of
and just to be fair, I never said it was easy. I just said this is what we need to do.
Yeah. No,
I'm an academic. It's easier for me to say this is where the hard work is.
Yeah.
I think if they got a blended finance transaction done in under 12 months, that's actually really very fast. I think I sort of agree with Bruce in one sense, which is there is an issue with perceived, to use your terminology, perceived risk. I think I would call it more, bankers particularly like to look to the past to work out sort of the returns and also the credit risk of the future. And one of the biggest challenges around climate is, the future, as we know, is not going to be like the past. And so we know that the policy environment is going to be different. We certainly know that the environmental environment is going to be different. And that poses some significant challenges for investors to try and get their heads around. And I think one of the great things about COP and the continued focus that we've seen, I think, across all sectors is that has shifted people's understanding of, the past is not really a good guide for the future in this case. However, I wish it was that simple. I think it is much more complicated. And I think I absolutely agree with what Bruce's framing. I think we need to differentiate a little bit between some of the sort of big emerging markets and some of the smaller emerging markets. And so if you let's take a positive story, take India. India has seen the single most successful and largest private sector auction of renewables in the world. And last year was a record year of, $0.5 billion investment into the renewable sector. And we've seen that massively going through. And you can see where good policy and then very clear direction, which we heard out of the last COP in terms of the direction of travel, in terms of electrification for India, kind of really provides the private sector with massive incentive. In other emerging markets, I think that there is both the importance of having a good policy environment and, the sort of the ease of doing business, but then we really need to drill down into each individual sort of sector. I don't think you can say at a macro level it's just the perception of risk. I think the challenges for, say, the energy sector in Kenya are radically different from the ones required in Indonesia. And that will be legal, it will be sort of regulatory, it will be financial. And actually, I think where we all need to move, and that's one of the good things about the implementation COP, is we kind of do need to drill into almost at a country by country, sector by sector level, and really think about how we unblock and drive the change going forward. One thing I would say, very much agree with though, is the importance of concessional capital to be catalytic. And I think one of the things here, and Veronica, you were very kind, I've done a lot of blended finance transactions, and I think one of the things that slows it down is there's always a concern in terms of the provider of concessional capital, whether that's a philanthropic source or a development bank or a multilateral, and the private sector, about what is the right balance of concessional capital. How much do you need to really mobilize the needed? Because obviously, as the provider of concessional, you want to minimize that to the least because you don't want to subsidize private sector profit. And from the private sector, you obviously want to minimize the amount of risk that you're carrying. And I think what we could collectively do is just be clearer with what levels of catalytic capital per situation we could be. And if someone could come out and publish a guidebook of this much in, say, the water sector in Africa versus this much for hydrogen in India, for example, I think that would help speed up the whole process.
Yeah, and I'm mindful that we're having this conversation in the context of a historic increase in interest rates. So for whatever concessionality we may have needed in the past, we might need any more. Do either of you have any perspectives of how should we be thinking about deploying finance in this much higher interest rate environment?
Well, it's a serious headwind, and it's unfortunate timing, to be perfectly honest, because we're showing a lot of momentum, and long-term investments are affected by higher interest rates. It's simple math at the end of the day, and we can't avoid that. And it's not just higher interest rates, it's higher real interest rates, because that's what really affects the cost of capital. And we appear to be in a new world when it comes to interest rates, and it's a headwind.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't underestimate how much of a boon to the renewable industry having very low interest rates for a very long time has been, because you're dealing typically with very long-dated financing. And so that, combined with a strong dollar, I think particularly in emerging markets that we've been talking about, I think financing conditions are now much harder. And I think that's why we collectively need to think about how do we not just put more money to work in this space, but how do we also get the money that's already there working harder? And I think that's one of the things that's being discussed at this COP is with the agenda around the Bretton Woods institutions who've done some fantastic work over a period of time, but are there ways that we can mobilize the balance sheets of the World Bank and the IFC even further? You know, do they need a AAA status to be able to do this? How much more money could they raise if they had a slightly lower credit grade? How much more could they do if they fully focused on just catalyzing as much private sector capital as possible? That debate's happening right now, and I think that's a really important discussion to continue to have.
Yeah, and then layering on that, these institutions were meant to promote economic growth and address poverty, how to fit climate into that mandate, recognizing that climate is so now inherent to economic growth, and what does that mean, therefore, for eligibility of countries for this type of concessional capital?
Do we need to move from the Bretton Woods institutions to the Sharm el-Sheikh ones?
Exactly,
right.
exactly. But you know, it's more than just money. And again, Bruce, this is something you've written about in your book, which is we often say, hey, there's a financing problem, but you have also found it's not just finance, it's permitting, it's getting projects unblocked. Can you just say a little bit more about that? And again, for the implementation COP, what does this mean?
And I wish it was just a financing problem, because we can unlock capital moves very quickly. It can. The challenge we have here is, you know, we have to rebuild the entire global economy. And it's a global economy we spent 300 years creating since the Industrial Revolution. It's an extraordinary amount of literally physical infrastructure, from buildings to automobiles to planes, everything. And it's a pretty amazing thing we've created.
And that's not just net zero, that's also for all the extreme weather. It's rebuilding for both.
It's rebuilding everything to mitigate and adapt, right?
Yeah.
And it's all physical. And the challenge here is, even with the financing, you actually have to build. And in many countries, that turns out to be a very slow process. To give you one example, the US has 7 electrical grids. Don't ask me why we have 7 instead of one efficient one. Well, we have 7. In one of those grids in the Northeast today, if you build a new solar or wind project, it takes 2 years before it can even be considered to connect into the grid. You can build solar or wind in 6 months, but you don't even get the chance to connect for 2 years and then go through the application process. And it's not unique to parts of the US. We see this problem in Europe and many other countries today. And whether it's issues of so-called NIMBYism or just planning processes or literally just physical constraints, where are you going to put all this is very slow. And we don't have the time. We have to rebuild 300 years of infrastructure in 30 years. And that's a big challenge. Now, that challenge has been made even worse by supply chain challenges and the fact that globalization is actually now slowing and going reverse. Now, globalization slowing is actually maybe good from a climate perspective, less shipping, less air. But from a rebuild the global economy perspective, it's actually creating a hurdle because you can't get things like solar panels when you need them or wind turbines when you need them. So that's another challenge, part of this. One silver lining. A lot of the building we need to do is in the lesser developed countries. And in fact, there, it's much easier to build and faster to build. And that's partly because you're building greenfield projects. And here I'd also add China and India, although they're now much more developed. You can build faster. We've seen that over and over again. So really this infrastructure challenge of rebuilding is particularly a developed world problem. And there's no easy solution to that one as far as I can see.
Yeah, this whole is there the money or the pipeline is a constant kind of debate. But I don't know about you, Daniel, but what I've been seeing is a number of financial institutions like banks rolling up their sleeves and saying, okay, let's crack on and build and get these projects off the ground. I don't know if you want to comment on how are banks then stepping up to kind of respond to what Bruce was saying.
Yeah, I think as Bruce said, look, we are seeing a rewiring of our economy, and as a result, we're seeing the rewiring of the financial sector as well. And I think every institution, whether it's banks, the sort of private capital, the multilaterals, we're all looking at what capabilities, what skill set, what risk appetite do we need to have to really play the role that we should be in society. And I think all of us would recognize we have a lot more work to do. And some of that is about capability building, so it's creating teams that can look at these new technologies that I've mentioned and really think about how you put capital. It's looking at the structuring in terms of what kind of project finance and other long-term financings you want to put in place. And it's looking at sort of financial innovation like transition bonds and other sorts of new products to really drive capital into it. And I think the other thing that we haven't talked about that we should just also briefly mention is it's climate, but it's also biodiversity, and it's about having those coming factors in. So where we see technology that can be scaled into that, we need to really move the needle as quickly as we can. And then I think collectively, back to this idea of having an ecosystem approach to these specific industries, thinking very carefully around these areas where the sort of green premium or the technology is not yet commercialized. What is the combination of private capital, development capital, concessional capital that can really unlock the difference? And there's a lot of thinking going on about that, but we've still got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Right. Well, we have a few minutes remaining. If you could offer any final words, both to the negotiators who are hard at work and those of us who are here to observe and engage, what are you hoping that in 2 weeks' time we'll be able to say about this COP?
Well, again, this being the implementation COP, I think it's extraordinarily important that we learn from each other. That's such an easy thing to say, but it really matters here because there's an unbelievable amount of activity going on in this space. When I say activity, investment is happening in many places, in many different forms. Building, rebuilding, implementing solutions is happening in many different forms, from very low-risk solar and wind to very risky, challenging, green hydrogen or other forms of energy generation and the like. And if we stay in sort of just our bubbles and go back to our countries and just go, well, now we have to do this and that, without really looking to who else has already done this, who has tried it, who has failed, learn from their failures, and then bring that back to wherever you are in whatever sector you're in, whether it's civil society or business or finance. Take those lessons home and implement the best practices that you can see out there. And I think that's what we need to accelerate this. Because at the end of the day, we will decarbonize. The physics will force us to decarbonize. The only question is, will we do it in 30 years. And that's all about, frankly, learning from each other and working a little faster and a little smarter.
Great. I love that. I love it. Daniel, how about you?
I mean, I think we should have confidence. I think that's we keep the momentum going, keep the confidence going. I mean, in the last 10 years, the cost of solar, wind has dropped by 90%. And I think the scale at which we are seeing innovation in things like green hydrogen, in things like sort of battery storage and other forms of energy storage is just accelerating even further. So I think collectively, policymakers, bankers, investors, if we can come out of this COP with confidence that we can see the route through that transition and put our backs to really accelerating that, that would be the best message to come out of the next few days.
Terrific, terrific. I love that. Learning, wisdom, conviction, confidence. I think if I might add one more, it would be heart. This journey ahead will also require courage, right? These are not easy answers. We all have to grapple with them. But I think as you can see from this panel, there's a lot that's happening and a lot we can be hopeful for in the future. So thank you, both of you, for joining, and thank you for the Times for hosting us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.